This is ChestertonRadio.com.
Introduction of On the Duties of the Clergy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy by St. Ambrose of Milan. Introduction. St. Ambrose, esteeming very highly the dignity of the ministerial office, was most desirous that the clergy of his diocese should live worthily of their high vocation, and be good and profitable examples to the people. Consequently, he undertook the following treatise, setting forth the duties of the clergy, and taking as a model the treatise of Cicero. The writer says that his object is to impress upon those whom he has ordained the lessons which he had previously taught them. Like Cicero, he treats of that which is right, becoming, or honourable, decorum, and what is expedient, utile, but with reference not to this life, but to that which is to come, teaching in the first book that which is becoming or honourable, in the second what is expedient, and in the third considering both in conjunction. In the first book he divides duties into ordinary, or the way of the commandments, binding upon all alike, and perfect, which consist in following the counsels. After treating then of some elementary duties, such as those towards parents and elders, he touches upon the two principles which lead the mind, reason and appetite, and shows that what is becoming consists in thinking of good and right things, and in the subjection of the appetite to reason, and supplies certain rules and examples, ending with a discussion on the four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. In the second book, passing from what is becoming to what is expedient, he points out that we can only measure what is really expedient by reference to eternal life, in contradiction to the errors of heathen philosophers, and shows that what is expedient consists in the knowledge of God and in good living. Incidentally, he shows that what is becoming is really that which is expedient, and ends the book with several chapters of practical considerations. In the third book he treats of duties of perfection, and lays down as a rule that in everything we must inquire what is expedient, not for individuals, but for many or for all. Nothing is to be striven after which is not becoming. To this everything must give place, not only expediency, but even friendship and life itself. By many examples he then proves how holy men have sought after what was becoming, and have thereby secured what was expedient. The object of St. Ambrose in basing his treatise on the lines of that of Cicero would seem to have been the confutation of some of the false principles of heathenism, and to show how much higher Christian morality is than that of the Gentiles. The treatise was probably composed about A.D. 391. End of introduction of On the Duties of the Clergy. Chapter 1 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy by St. Ambrose, Book the First, Chapter 1. A bishop's special office is to teach. St. Ambrose himself, however, has to learn in order that he may teach, or rather he has to teach what he has not learned. At any rate, learning and teaching with himself must go on together. I think I shall not seem to be taking too much on myself, if in the midst of my children I yield to my desire to teach, seeing that the Master of humility himself has said, "Come ye children unto me, I will teach you the fear of the Lord," wherein one may observe both the humility and the grace of his reverence for God. For in saying the fear of the Lord, which seems to be common to all, he has described the chief mark of reverence for God. As, however, fear itself is the beginning of wisdom, and the source of blessedness, for they that fear the Lord are blessed. He has plainly marked himself out as the teacher for instruction in wisdom, and the guide to the attainment of blessedness. We, therefore, being anxious to imitate his reverence for God, and not without justification in dispensing grace, delivered to you as to children those things which the Spirit of wisdom has imparted to him, and which have been made clear to us through him, and learnt by sight and by example. For we can no longer now escape from the duty of teaching, which the needs of the priesthood have laid upon us, though we tried to avoid it. For God gave some apostles, and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers. I do not therefore claim for myself the glory of the apostles, for who can do this save those whom the Son of God himself has chosen? Nor the grace of the prophets, nor the virtue of the evangelists, nor the cautious care of the pastors. I only desire to attain to that care and diligence in the sacred writings, which the apostle has placed last amongst the duties of the saints. And this very thing I desire, so that, in the endeavour to teach, I may be able to learn. For one is the true master, who alone has not learnt what he taught all. But men learn before they teach, and receive from him what they may hand on to others. But not even this was the case with me, for I was carried off from the judgment seat, and the garb, infulis, of office, to enter on the priesthood, and began to teach you what I myself had not yet learned. So it happened that I began to teach before I began to learn. Therefore I must learn and teach at the same time, since I had no leisure to learn before. End of Chapter 1, Book the First. Chapter 2 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy, by St. Ambrose, Book the First, Chapter 2. Manifold dangers are incurred by speaking, the remedy for which Scripture shows to consist in silence. Now, what ought we to learn before everything else, but to be silent, that we may be able to speak? Lest my voice should condemn me, before that of another acquit me. For it is written, By thy words thou shalt be condemned. What need is there, then, that thou shouldst hasten to undergo the danger of condemnation by speaking, when thou canst be more safe by keeping silent? How many have I seen to fall into sin by speaking, but scarcely one by keeping silent? And so it is more difficult to know how to keep silent than how to speak. I know that most persons speak because they do not know how to keep silent. It is seldom that anyone is silent, even when speaking profits him nothing. He is wise, then, who knows how to keep silent. Lastly, the wisdom of God said, The Lord hath given to me the tongue of learning, that I should know when it is good to speak. Justly, then, is he wise who has received of the Lord to know when he ought to speak. Wherefore the Scripture says well, A wise man will keep silence until there is opportunity. Therefore the saints of the Lord loved to keep silence, because they knew that a man's voice is often the utterance of sin, and a man's speech is the beginning of human error. Lastly, the saint of the Lord said, I said, I will take heed to my ways, that I offend not in my tongue. For he knew, and had read, that it was a mark of the divine protection for a man to be hid from the scourge of his own tongue, and the witness of his own conscience. We are chastised by the silent reproaches of our thoughts, and by the judgment of conscience. We are chastised also by the lash of our own voice, when we say things whereby our soul is mortally injured, and our mind is sorely wounded. But who is there that has his heart clean from the impurities of sin, and does not offend in his tongue? And so, As he saw there was no one who could keep his mouth free from evil speaking, he laid upon himself the law of innocency by rule of silence, with a view to avoiding by silence that fault which he could with difficulty escape in speaking. Let us hearken then to the master of precaution. I said, I will take heed to my ways. That is, I said to myself, in the silent biddings of my thoughts, I have enjoined upon myself that I should take heed to my ways. Some ways there are which we ought to follow, others as to which we ought to take heed. We must follow the ways of the Lord, and take heed to our own ways, lest they lead us into sin. One can take heed if one is not hasty in speaking. The law says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God. It said not, Speak, but hear. Eve fell because she said to the man what she had not heard from the Lord her God. The first word from God says to thee, Hear. If thou hearest, take heed to thy ways. And if thou hast fallen, quickly amend thy way. For, wherein does a young man amend his way, except in taking heed to the word of the Lord? Be silent therefore first of all, hearken, that thou fail not in thy tongue. It is a great evil that a man should be condemned by his own mouth. Truly, if each one shall give account for an idle word, how much more for words of impurity and shame? For words uttered hastily are far worse than idle words. If therefore an account is demanded for an idle word, how much more will punishment be exacted for impious language? End of chapter 2 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. Chapter 3 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy by St. Ambrose, Book the First, Chapter 3. Silence should not remain unbroken, nor should it arise from idleness. How heart and mouth must be guarded against inordinate affections. What then? Ought we to be dumb? Certainly not. For there is a time to keep silence and time to speak. If then we are to give account for an idle word, let us take care that we do not have to give it also for an idle silence. For there is also an active silence, such as Susanna's was, who did more by keeping silence than if she had spoken. For in keeping silence before men she spoke to God, and found no greater proof of her chastity than silence. Her conscience spoke where no word was heard, and she sought no judgment for herself at the hands of men, for she had the witness of the Lord. She therefore desired to be acquitted by him who she knew could not be deceived in any way. Yea, the Lord himself in the Gospel worked out in silence the salvation of men. David rightly therefore enjoined on himself not constant silence, but watchfulness. Let us then guard our hearts, let us guard our mouths. Both have been written about. In this place we are bidden to take heed to our mouth. In another place thou art told, Keep thy heart with all diligence. If David took heed, wilt thou not take heed? If Isaiah had unclean lips, who said, Woe is me, for I am undone, for I am a man, and have unclean lips. If a prophet of the Lord had unclean lips, how shall we have them clean? But for whom was it written, unless it was for each one of us? Hedge thy possession about with thorns, and bind up thy silver and gold, and make a door, and a bar for thy mouth, and a yoke and a balance for thy words. Thy possession is thy mind, thy gold thy heart, thy silver thy speech. The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in the fire. A good mind is also a good possession, and, further, a pure inner life is a valuable possession. Hedging, then, this possession of thine, enclose it with thought, guard it with thorns, that is, with pious care, lest the fierce passions of the flesh should rush upon it, and lead it captive, lest strong emotions should assault it, and overstepping their bounds, carry off its vintage. Guard thy inner self. Do not neglect or contemn it, as though it were worthless, for it is a valuable possession, truly valuable indeed, for its fruit is not perishable, and only for a time, but is lasting and diffuse for eternal salvation. Cultivate therefore thy possession, and let it be thy tilling ground. Bind up thy words, that they run not riot, and grow wanton, and gather up sins for themselves in too much talking. Let them be rather confined, and held back within their own banks. An overflowing river quickly gathers mud. Bind up also thy meaning. Let it not be left slack and unchecked, lest it be said of thee, There is no healing balsam, nor oil, nor bandage to apply. Sobriety of mind has its reins, whereby it is directed and guided. Let there be a door to thy mouth, that it may be shut when need arises, and let it be carefully barred, that none may arouse thy voice to anger, and thou pay back abuse with abuse. Thou hast heard it read to-day, Be ye angry, and sin not. Therefore, although we are angry, this arising from the motions of our nature, not of our will, let us not utter with our mouth one evil word, lest we fall into sin. And let there be a yoke and a balance to thy words, that is, humility and moderation, that thy tongue may be subject to thy mind. Let it be held in check with a tight rein. Let it have its own means of restraint, whereby it can be recalled to moderation. Let it utter words tried by the scales of justice, that there may be seriousness in our meaning, weight in our speech, and due measure in our words. End of Chapter 3 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. Chapter 4 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy, by St. Ambrose. Book the First, Chapter 4. The same care must be taken that our speech proceed not from evil passions, but from good motives. For here it is that the devil is especially on the watch to catch us. If anyone takes heed to this, he will be mild, gentle, modest. For in guarding his mouth and restraining his tongue, and in not speaking before examining, pondering, and weighing his words, as to whether this should be said, that should be answered, or whether it be a suitable time for this remark, he certainly is practising modesty, gentleness, patience. So he will not burst out into speech through displeasure or anger, nor give sign of any passion in his words, nor proclaim that the flames of lust are burning in his language, or that the incentives of wrath are present in what he says. Let him act thus for fear that his words, which ought to grace his inner life, should at last plainly show and prove that there is some vice in his morals. For then especially does the enemy lay his plans, when he sees passions engendered in us. Then he supplies tinder, then he lays snares. Wherefore the prophet says not without cause, as we heard read to-day, Surely he hath delivered me from the snare of the hunter, and from the hard word. Symmachus said this means the word of provocation, others, the word that brings disquiet. The snare of the enemy is our speech, but that itself is also just as much an enemy to us. Too often we say something that our foe takes hold of, and whereby he wounds us as though by our own sword. How far better it is to perish by the sword of others than by our own. Accordingly the enemy tests our arms and clashes together his weapons. If he sees that I am disturbed, he implants the points of his darts so as to raise up a crop of quarrels. If I utter an unseemly word, he sets his snare, then he puts before me the opportunity for revenge as a bait, so that in desiring to be revenged I may put myself in the snare, and draw the death knot tight for myself. If anyone feels this enemy is near, he ought to give greater heed to his mouth, lest he make room for the enemy, but not many see him. End of chapter 4 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. Chapter 5 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy by St. Ambrose, Book the First, Chapter 5. We must guard also against a visible enemy when he incites us by silence, by the help of which alone we can escape from those greater than ourselves, and maintain that humility which we must display towards all. But we must also guard against him who can be seen, and who provokes us, and spurs us on, and exasperates us, and supplies what will excite us to licentiousness or lust. If then anyone reviles us, irritates, stirs us up to violence, tries to make us quarrel, let us keep silence, let us not be ashamed to become dumb, for he who irritates us and does an injury is committing sin, and wishes us to become like himself. Certainly, if thou art silent, and hidest thy feelings, he is wont to say, Why are you silent? Speak if you dare. But you dare not, you are dumb, I have made you speechless. If thou art silent, he is the more excited. He thinks himself beaten, laughed at, little thought of, and ridiculed. If thou answerest, he thinks he has become the victor, because he has found one like himself. For if thou art silent, men will say, That man has been abusive, but this one held him in contempt. If thou return the abuse, they will say, Both have been abusive. Both will be condemned, neither will be acquitted. Therefore it is his object to irritate, so that I may speak and act as he does. But it is the duty of a just man to hide his feelings and say nothing, to preserve the fruit of a good conscience, to trust himself rather to the judgment of good men than to the insolence of a calumniator, and to be satisfied with the stability of his own character. For that is, to keep silence even from good words, since one who has a good conscience ought not to be troubled by false words, nor ought he to make more of another's abuse than of the witness of his own heart. So then, let a man guard also his humility. If, however, he is unwilling to appear too humble, he thinks as follows, and says within himself, Am I to allow this man to despise me, and say such things to my face against me, as though I could not open my mouth before him? Why should I not also say something whereby I can grieve him? Am I to let him do me wrong, as though I were not a man, and as though I could not avenge myself? Is he to bring charges against me, as though I could not bring together worse ones against him? Whoever speaks like this is not gentle and humble, nor is he without temptation. The tempter stirs him up, and himself puts such thoughts in his heart. Often and often, too, the evil spirit employs another person, and gets him to say such things to him. But do thou set thy foot firm on the rock. Although a slave should abuse, let the just man be silent, and if a weak man utter insults, let him be silent, and if a poor man should make accusations, let him not answer. These are the weapons of the just man, so that he may conquer by giving way, as those skilled in throwing the javelin are wont to conquer by giving way, and in flight to wound their pursuers with severer blows. End of chapter 5, Book the First. Chapter 6 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy by St. Ambrose, Book the First, Chapter 6. In this matter we must imitate David's silence and humility, so as not even to seem deserving of harm. What need is there to be troubled when we hear abuse? Why do we not imitate him who says, "I was dumb and humbled myself, and kept silence even from good words"? Or did David only say this, and not act up to it? No, he also acted up to it. For when Shimei, the son of Gera, reviled him, David was silent, and although he was surrounded with armed men, he did not return the abuse, nor sought revenge. Nay, even when the son of Zeruiah spoke to him, because he wished to take vengeance on him, David did not permit it. He went on as though dumb and humbled. He went on in silence. Nor was he disturbed, although called a bloody man, for he was conscious of his own gentleness. He therefore was not disturbed by insults, for he had full knowledge of his own good works. He then, who is quickly roused by wrong, makes himself seem deserving of insult, even whilst he wishes to be shown not to deserve it. He who despises wrongs is better off than he who grieves over them, for he who despises them looks down on them as though he feels them not, but he who grieves over them is tormented, just as though he actually felt them. End of Chapter 6, Book the First. Chapter 7 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy by St. Ambrose, Book the First, Chapter 7. How admirably Psalm 39 takes the place of an introduction. Incited thereto by this psalm, the saint determines to write on duties. He does this with more reason even than Cicero, who wrote on this subject to his son. How, further, this is so. Not without thought did I make use of the beginning of this psalm in writing to you, my children. For this psalm, which the prophet David gave to Jeduthun to sing, I urge you to regard, being delighted myself with its depth of meaning and the excellency of its maxims. For we have learnt in those words we have just shortly touched upon, that both patience in keeping silence and the duty of awaiting a fit time for speaking are taught in this psalm, as well as contempt of riches in the following verses, which things are the chief groundwork of virtues. Whilst, therefore, meditating on this psalm, it has come to my mind to write on the duties. Although some philosophers have written on this subject, Panaetius, for instance, and his son amongst the Greek, Cicero amongst the Latin writers, I do not think it foreign to my office to write also myself. And as Cicero wrote for the instruction of his son, so I too write to teach you, my children. For I love you whom I have begotten in the gospel, no less than if you were my own true sons. For nature does not make us love more ardently than grace. We certainly ought to love those who we think will be with us for evermore, than those who will be with us in this world only. These often are born unworthy of their race, so as to bring disgrace on their father. But you were chose beforehand to love. They are loved naturally, of necessity, which is not a sufficiently suitable and constant teacher to implant a lasting love. But ye are loved on the ground of our deliberate choice, whereby a great feeling of affection is combined with the strength of our love. Thus one tests what one loves, and loves what one has chosen. End of Chapter 7, Book the First. Chapter 8 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy by St. Ambrose, Book the First, Chapter 8. The word duty has been often used both by philosophers and in the Holy Scriptures, from whence it is derived. Since therefore the person concerned is one fit to write on the duties, let us see whether the subject itself stands on the same ground, and whether this word is suitable only to the schools of the philosophers, or is also to be found in the sacred Scriptures. Beautifully has the Holy Spirit, as it happens, brought before us a passage in reading the Gospel today, as though he would urge us to write, whereby we are confirmed in our view, that the word officium, duty, may also be used with us. For when Zacharias the priest was struck dumb in the temple, and could not speak, it is said, and it came to pass that as soon as the days of his duty, officii, were accomplished, he departed to his own house. We read, therefore, that the word officium, duty, can be used by us. And this is not inconsistent with reason, since we consider that the word officium, duty, is derived from efficere, to effect, and is formed with the change of one letter for the sake of euphony, or at any rate, that you should do those things which injure, officiant no one, but benefit all. End of Chapter 8, Book the First. Chapter 9 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy by St. Ambrose, Book the First, Chapter 9. A duty is to be chosen from what is virtuous, and from what is useful, and also from the comparison of the two, one with the other. But nothing is recognized by Christians as virtuous or useful which is not helpful to the future life. This treatise on duty, therefore, will not be superfluous. The philosophers considered that duties were derived from what is virtuous and what is useful, and that from these two one should choose the better. Then, they say, it may happen that two virtuous or two useful things will clash together, and the question is, which is the more virtuous, and which is the more useful? First, therefore, duty is divided into three sections: what is virtuous, what is useful, and what is the better of two. Then again, these three are divided into 5 classes, that is, 2 that are virtuous, 2 that are useful, and lastly, the right judgment as to the choice between them. The first, they say, has to do with the moral dignity and integrity of life, the second with the conveniences of life, with wealth, resources, opportunities, whilst a right judgment must underlie the choice of any of them. This is what the philosophers say. But we measure nothing at all but that which is fitting and virtuous, and that by the rule of things future rather than of things present, and we state nothing to be useful but what will help us to the blessing of eternal life, certainly not that which will help us enjoy merely the present time. Nor do we recognize any advantages in opportunities and in the wealth of earthly goods, but consider them as disadvantages if not put aside, and to be looked on as a burden when we have them, rather than as a loss when expended. This work of ours, therefore, is not superfluous, seeing that we and they regard duty in quite different ways. They reckon the advantages of this life among the good things. We reckon them among the evil things. For he who receives good things here, as the rich man in the parable, is tormented there, and Lazarus, who endured evil things here, there found comfort. Lastly, those who do not read their writings may read ours if they will, if, that is, they do not require great adornment of language or a skilfully treated subject, but are satisfied with the simple charm of the subject itself. End of Chapter 9. Book the First. Chapter 10 of On the Duties of the Clergy, Book the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Duties of the Clergy by St. Ambrose, Book the First, Chapter 10. What is seemly is often found in the sacred writings long before it appears in the books of the philosophers. Pythagoras borrowed the law of his silence from David. David's rule, however, is the best, for our first duty is to have due measure in speaking. We are instructed and taught that what is seemly is put in our scriptures in the first place. In Greek it is called prepon, for we read, "A hymn beseems thee, O God in Zion." In Greek this is "Soi prepei hymnos ho Theos en Sion," and the Apostle says, "Speak the things which become sound doctrine." And elsewhere, "For it beseemed him through whom are all things and for whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings." Was Pennatius or Aristotle, who also wrote on duty, earlier than David? Why, Pythagoras himself, who lived before the time of Socrates, followed the prophet David's steps and gave his disciples a law of silence. He went so far as to restrain his disciples from the use of speech for 5 years. David, on the other hand, gave his law not with a view to impair the gift of nature, but to teach us to take heed to the words we utter. Pythagoras again made his rule that he might teach men to speak by not speaking, but David made his, so that by speaking we might learn the more how to speak. How can there be instruction without exercise, or advance without practice? A man wishing to undergo a warlike training daily exercises himself with his weapons. As though ready for action, he rehearses his part in the fight and stands forth just as if the enemy were in position before him. Or with a view to acquiring skill and strength in throwing the javelin, he either puts his own arms to the proof, or avoids the blows of his foes, and escapes them by his watchful attention. The man that desires to navigate a ship on the sea, or to row, tries first on a river. They who wish to acquire an agreeable style of singing and a beautiful voice begin by bringing out their voice gradually by singing, and they who seek to win the crown of victory by strength of body and in a regular wrestling match harden their limbs by daily practice in the wrestling school, foster their endurance, and accustom themselves to hard work. Nature herself teaches us this in the case of infants, for they first exercise themselves in the sounds of speech, and so learn to speak. Thus these sounds of speech are a kind of practice, and a school for the voice. Let those, then, who want to learn to take heed in speaking, not refuse what is according to nature, but let them use all watchful care, just as those who are on the watch-tower keep on the alert by watching, and not by going to sleep. For everything is made more perfect and strong by exercises proper and suitable to itself. David, therefore, was not always silent, but only for a time. Not perpetually, nor to all did he refuse to speak, but he used not to answer the enemy that provoked him, the sinner that exasperated him. As he says elsewhere, "As though he were deaf, he heard not them that speak vanity and imagine deceit, and as though he were dumb, he opened not his mouth to them." Again, in another place it is said, "Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like to him." The first duty, then, is to have due measure in our speech. In this way a sacrifice of praise is offered up to God. Thus a godly fear is shown when the sacred scriptures are read. Thus parents are honoured. I know well that many speak because they know not how to keep silence. But it is not often anyone is silent when speaking does not profit him. A wise man, intending to speak, first carefully considers what he is to say, and to whom he is to say it, also where and at what time. There is, therefore, such a thing as due measure in keeping silence, and also in speaking. There is also such a thing as a due measure in what we do. It is a glorious thing to maintain the right standard of duty. End of chapter 10, Book the First.
This is ChestertonRadio.com.